Okay, apparently we're good to go, and close enough time-wise. So this talk is about Hopscotch. Hopscotch refers to two things: the IDE for the Newspeak language and the underlying GUI application framework that it uses. And I should, before I start out, even though I'm presenting it, this is all Vasily Bykov's work. He designed the framework, he implemented it. He implemented most of the IDE. There are bits of the IDE you'll see that other people have added on, even myself and Peter Ahe and others. But mostly it's Vasily's baby. Now I figured that even though probably a lot of you were here maybe last year and heard about Newspeak, there are probably some people who haven't really heard about Newspeak. So I'll give you a very quick flashback. So I probably have to push something here. Yes. Right. So about in January of last year, I was here and spent a whole talk on Newspeak. So I'm just going to give you the highlights very, very quickly, just so you know why this might potentially be interesting. So Newspeak is a language in the Smalltalk tradition. There was some discussion here this morning about Smalltalk, which made it clear that most people here don't know very much about it. And it's a dynamically typed language. It's a reflective language. And Newspeak is different from Smalltalk in a number of respects. The two key ones are on the board. One is that all names, without exception, are late bound. In Smalltalk parlance, that means everything is a message send. In English, you can assume that everything is a virtual method call. And the other thing is that there's no global scope. And this has lots of interesting implications. There have been languages that have one or the other of these properties, not many, and they're kind of usually interesting. But as far as I know, putting them together in this way is unique to Newspeak. And implications of this are, for example, there's no static state. There's nowhere to hang the static state, because you would have to send a message to an object to get at the static state, and that object would have to be global for it to be really static and long-lived, which is what we usually mean by static state. So you can't have it, and that's a good thing. The other thing is that classes nest arbitrarily, which is not absolutely essential as an implication of this, but you're very much driven toward it, because again, there's no other way, there's no other structuring device except for classes. There's no namespaces, packages, anything you can hang things through. Other implications that are interesting: classes have to be first-class values, again, because the only way you can access anything is essentially through the equivalent of a virtual method call. So classes are accessed essentially through accessor methods. They've got to return you something. Because everything is late-bound, everything is virtual, all classes are always virtual. In particular, superclass names are late-bound, so essentially every class is a mix-in, because when you define a class, you don't really know statically who its superclass is going to be. And because classes nest and you combine it with those other three things, you can do class hierarchy inheritance. You can mix in entire libraries of classes and things like that. Another implication is top-level classes are module definitions. Again, there's no global scope. If you're a top-level class, there's no names you can refer to outside yourself. You're inherently a self-contained namespace. Instances of these module definitions, instances of these classes, are modules, and they're basically sandboxed inherently, because, again, they can't refer to anything outside that top-level class. The only way to connect them to the outside world and get them to do anything is to pass in arguments. And those arguments are sent to the factory method that creates the instance, and they're your only connection to the outside world. So they act as capabilities, and those capabilities define a sandbox. These modules are reentrant. They can't interfere with each other because there's no static state. Each object has its own state, unless you go to some trouble and pass them shared objects so that they can mess with each other. But it makes it very easy to do things like side-by-side deployment of multiple copies of the same library, or multiple implementations, different implementations of the same library. You can handle those polymorphically just as you can with instances of individual classes in a conventional language. So Newspeak, I think, is kind of an interesting language. We'll be seeing a little bit of Newspeak code, but none of this will really help you follow that, because mainly you'll have to follow the keyword syntax. But just some background why we're doing this. So Hopscotch. Hopscotch, again, we'll do a flashback. what do you do when you say in our last episode? You're supposed to have a cliffhanger, right? So typically you want to you leave your hero in some unseemly state and expect to rescue him or something. So the hero should be trapped. And this is indeed what traditionally happens in a lot of small talks. This is our hero right here. This is the Newspeak IDE, basically the Hopscotch browser that I'll be talking about. And as you can see, it's trapped. It's trapped inside a bigger window. This is we run on top of Squeak Smalltalk, and Squeak Smalltalk has this nice feature that it lives in its own little world, and everything is kind of enclosed in that, and it's fairly hard to get out. And it has its own window system that can do fascinating things. You can take a browser and make it play music and rotate and croak like a frog, and you can still type into it and change classes and stuff. Very interesting properties of the morphic system, but not quite as useful as one might hope. And so the question is, of course, whether we can allow our hero to escape. So here we have, again, the actual running thing, and this is the Hopscotch browser. And let's find out if we can make it escape. And I don't know if this is going to work because now I'm on two screens, and it's kind of messed with my my plan. Yeah, so this showed up. So anyway, it did escape. Actually, in a way, it works even better, right? It's gone. It's over here. Right? It's gone out to be a real live window. And we'll see. How do I make this thing do its thing again? I guess I'll do this. And right. So this is actually not just a piece of pyrotechnics, as we'll see. But first, a few words about the architecture of this thing. So the IDE is the top-level layer, and it runs on top of this library I've alluded to, the Hopscotch framework. This, in turn, runs on a thing called Brazil, named after the movie. We have this sort of dystopia theme. And Brazil is a widget GUI library. I guess it's a portable retained graphics 2D widget library. And what connects Brazil to reality, to the underlying platform, as it will, is a mapping layer. And what you just saw is that the mapping layer binds dynamically. So we can switch and make something bind to Squeak's old-fashioned Windows or to Windows and potentially to Windows on other operating systems. And that's actually not, there's a reason why it has to be this way. Like most Smalltalks, we use snapshots. Snapshots are a double-edged sword. Essentially, right, for those who might not know, the idea is that you can capture the entire state of your running system, of your process, the heap, the stacks, the threads, the whole thing, freeze dry it into a persistent state, and take that and reconstitute it some other time, some other place, independently of the operating system, etc. And it's a double-edged sword, but it's kind of handy for a bunch of things, right? When you have to get on an airplane and you're in the middle of something, when you want to do a demo and arrange things just so and not have a canned demo, when you have a bug report, you don't have to send a stack trace. You can send the stack, right? So people can actually interact with it. Recovery, well, it can either make recovery hard or easy, depending. And it's also good for rapid startup, a point which I, in 10 years at Javasoft, did not manage to convey, I'm afraid. But in any case, it's a nice thing. Newspeak isn't going to insist always on having snapshots. We're pretty close to being independent of that because, as I say, it's a double-edged sword. But if you're doing this, you're going to have to bind the native windows dynamically, because when you reconstitute this image, obviously you're going to get new handles from the operating system. They can't be part of your freeze-dried representation. And if you want to take that image and run it, say, on another operating system, then again, what you want is those windows to open up as whatever windows that operating system gives you. And so again, making this dynamic is useful in that respect. But it just gave me an excuse, A, to do some pyrotechnics, and B, to mention the idea of an image which eventually more people will use than do today. It takes 20, 30 years sometimes, but eventually the good ideas do win. So Hopscotch, as I said, the library is a GUI application framework. It's a lot like HTML in some ways, except it's prettier. So it's document-based. it manages navigation for you. It gives you, and it provides a domain-specific language for composing bits of graphical presentation, and also makes sure that that your GUIs are non-modal. And so we should probably just look at it. If I can remember which window we had. Right. So I'm hoping people, I don't know if people in the back can see much of this, but you can see that basically there's something here that there are some web browsery things up there, right? There's back, forward and back arrows and things like that. This is essentially the home page of the Newspeak IDE. And depending on what state you're in, it'll show you different stuff. Right now, it's showing you a list of classes that I've been to recently. So if I want to go to one of these classes, right, it's hyperlinked. I can click on this, and now I'm in a class browser, right? It's showing me a particular class. This is a class from our sort of Hello World demo. It's basically a file browser. It's called Brave New World Explorer. You may know of a file browser that's called an Explorer too. It consists of two nested classes. These two guys here, I don't know if the people in the back can read the word classes, but believe me, it says classes here, and there's two nested classes. And again, I can link to them, I can go back, I can see where I've been forward or backward, various navigational things like that. These classes are very typical of a Hopscotch library application. One of them is called a presenter, and one of them is called a subject, file presenter and file subject. It's a lot like model view controller, right? The presenter handles presentation. It's like a view. The subject isn't like a model. The model is a file. And files don't know anything about this application or any other GUI application, right? The subject is actually the thing that, it's the subject of the presentation. It's what really stores the application logic. And so we can also view this stuff in context. So I can actually open it up without going to a different page. And sometimes that's useful. It's more useful if you have better resolution than 1024 than 768. And if I wanted to open it on its own page, I can do that. It'll open up on the other screen, but here it did open up, right? So I have these reasonable navigation and viewing options. I have a history, just like in a web browser, of various places I've been. Unlike web browsers, this is actually much more useful when you're working in an IDE, because you tend to have a working set. You've visited a number of classes, a number of tools, and you're never more than 2 clicks away from any of them, because this history acts as a hub. And all of these things are things that the framework is providing us. They're not unique to the IDE. You get these when you do an application. So for example, when we run this particular application, which we will in a little while, we'll see that all these features are available as part of that framework. But what's kind of interesting to see here is how you can use a web-style navigation in an IDE without feeling that you're working with something brain dead, because it isn't actually a web browser and it doesn't have latency problems and so forth. One of the things I like to show here, so here we've got a method, right? So I can collapse, expand these methods and look at them and things like that. One of the features I like to show is a menu item called Inspect Presenter. As I said, presenters are used in the framework for presentation. And what this does is it opens up an object inspector on the presenter object that's actually running in the IDE presenting that tool that I was looking at. So this is actually an object inspector on the presenter that was showing that method. And I can evaluate stuff in that context. For example, let me do this. And I'll go back. And remember this guy was open? I typed collapse, and now it's closed. And if I go back here and type expand, it's expanded, right? So this proves that this actually is the right object, right? So I am in sort of remote control of my IDE from within the IDE. But what's actually useful about this thing is, being an object inspector, it has a link to the class. So if I wanted to find out which class, which code was actually implementing this feature in my system, I can just open one of these guys and click on this, and here I am, and I can find the code that actually runs it. And then I can change it, right? I can do things like, here, I'm going to change one line here, and I don't know if you can read it, but it said method heading color, and it's something that determines the color that's displayed in these methods. And so I'm going to change it, and then I'm going to go back here, and I'll collapse it and open it up again, and it's not working. Interesting. Fascinating. This is the beauty of a live demo. What am I doing different? Okay, I guess I had to hit refresh on those browsers. I'm not sure. That shouldn't have been. Anyway, I have now changed it to this beautiful color, which presumably I wanted. The point is that I've changed the behavior of my IDE while the IDE is running and customize it however I want. And the point I'm trying to convey here is if you use a dynamic language to implement your IDE, then interesting things happen that are hard to introduce when your IDE is implemented in a static language. And so that's kind of cool. What else can we do here? One of the properties of this navigation paradigm, again, very much like a web browser, is that we can seamlessly tie tools. Well, we've already seen that, right? We've gone from the class browser to the object inspector, from the home page to the class browser and back. And we can do other things. Go back to the home page. We have here a class that represents unit tests. And because it's a class that represents unit tests, the IDE figures this out and gives me a menu option that lets me run the tests. And it'll do its thing, and I'll jabber on while it does its thing. But eventually it's going to show us a view of the test results. Right? Again, the point here is that you can move from one tool to another because the Hopscotch browser itself is not so much a tool as a meta tool, very much like a web browser is. It's a tool for composing other tools. And once this thing is, come on, you can do it. Right? So now we have a listing of all our tests, and 87 of them succeeded, and this is not expanded because no one is interested in your successes. People are only interested in your failures, if you haven't noticed. So failures, we actually don't have failures, we have errors. And if we look at an error, so again, we can actually look at the same method browser that we were using in these class browsers, right? We now have individual test methods embedded in this view, listed according to their test status. And we have this hideous green because I didn't bother to change it back. And I can now run an individual test and find out more about, what went wrong with it. So now, over here, I have a report on the error. If I expand it, what I get here is, again, another one of those object inspectors, except it's embedded in place. And it's just an object inspector on the exception, which really isn't that interesting because mainly it tells me a string that's an error message. But what's more interesting is that I have this little debug link. And that gets me to the debugger. And the debugger is basically, the stack. But what's a little different from most debuggers is that I can open up multiple stack frames at once. Right? I can see, if I want to, I can see the entire stack. I can open up each frame. In fact, an inspector on this frame shows me essentially the method involved and an object inspector on the activation, which has things like the receiver, right? So I can go and look at what the receiver is, and I can open that, and I get another little embedded object inspector on that particular object. But of course, if I wanted to, I could click on it and see it on its own page, right? If I'm short of real estate or whatever, because all the usual linking behavior, is available in the same way to all the tools by virtue of using this framework. So that is again, two things I want to emphasize, right? In my view, this is the only way to do a debugger GUI, right? When you draw a stack on the whiteboard, you draw a stack, and you can expand the frames and talk about what's in them. But most debuggers sort of put you in this contortion where you basically are looking at one frame at a time. Or you see the whole list, but you can't really look into the frame. Whereas here the visual metaphor for the debugger is the natural visual metaphor of the stack. This idea isn't new, at least to some of you, but despite being around for, I don't know, 20 years or so, it's not out there. And again, it illustrates the sort of seamless integration of tools. So we've seen debugger, unit testing, object inspector, etc. And you can keep adding, as we expand and evolve this environment, we can add more tools that we might need. What else did I want to say here? Fragments. So how do we actually get this stuff to work? We get it to work by virtue of this domain-specific language where you define your presentation by using essentially a combinator library. What it combines are fragments of presentation. So atomic widgets, for example, might be leaf fragments, but we have also compound fragments, and we compose them via these combinators. For example, we've got things like blank, which is just a blank space, or filler, which is sort of an elastic blank space that will fill up any area you need. Creating a button, is one operation that gets you a button, or a hyperlink, things like that, menus. These are sort of atomic things. And then we have these aggregate combinators, like making a row of stuff, right? So they take a list of combinators of fragments and build you a row or a column, or they center it. Or, for example, if you have a GUI element that should be computed in the background, have a deferred combinator that takes a closure that is going to compute it and will see to it that, it'll show up when that computation is done in the background, and you don't have to reinvent this time and again. That's how we handle drag and drop, for example, as well. So let's go back and see some of this stuff. Right, let's go back to our history and go back to Brave New World, or rather to File Presenter. Right, so this is an example, right? This method that we were looking at earlier, right? It's a user-defined combinator, right? Because it's a method we've written. It takes a fragment as an argument and returns a fragment as a result. These are optional type annotations that as yet mean nothing, but they're still quite handy. Because most of the stuff that you want out of a type system in terms of documentation for the programmer and for the environment, IntelliSense, etc., it's really metadata. I know some people feel strongly differently, and I'll let them savage me in a few moments. But what you have here is you're building this thing out of these combinators. So maybe you aren't comfortable with this keyword syntax, but in this context, it looks very much like a domain-specific language for defining these graphical things. If you look at some of the tools that have been done specifically for this purpose, they look very, very similar. So it basically takes some fragment, creates a column. In the middle of the column is a row with some padding on the side, and in the middle it sticks that fragment that you passed in, and then it colors the whole thing gray. And where is this thing used? Let's find out where it's used. It's used in the Explorer. And what I'm going to do now is open up one of these. This is a workspace, again, another tool, which is basically a glorified inspector. It's an inspector on a particular kind of object that lets me evaluate, random stuff in the environment. And once I evaluate that, it'll open up in the wrong place. And this is actually Brave New World Explorer running, again, using that same framework. And it's open on my home directory here. And I can expand it. And I can find the Newspeak directory and expand that. And I can even find my lang.net presentation in here. I can also go and link. Sorry about that. Right, I can link to these things, right? The same kind of links, and then I can link to the lang.net directory, and I can link to the DSL conference directory. And if I look at my history, now I've got essentially a list of all the directories I visited, right? So that just happens because the framework is providing that facility. And I didn't have to engineer this feature into my file browser, because I'm using a framework that basically supports the kind of basic navigation that people want. And we were going to talk about where this bar combinator is used. This is a bar right here, right? It's gray and it's got some stuff stuck into it, right? So this is where that method got called to actually engineer a particular look using those combinators. And that's sort of as far as demoing what I wanted to show. And really, that's all there is to say about Hopscotch. And except that, the whole thing is now made another escape, right? The last time I spoke in January, it also had to escape from the clutches of the people who funded it. Often a difficult thing, but we've gotten that done. So it's open source under Apache, and it's downloadable, and it's always work in progress, and things will change. But if anyone's interested, you can look at it. Points I want to emphasize again. Basically, having dynamism in your IDE is more than just running an IDE with a dynamic language. It's running when you have an IDE written in a dynamic language, you get a whole new experience. This is actually the magic that people talk about when they talk about Smalltalk. And it has to be experienced. You can't you can't transmit it to a C programmer with the current state of surgery. And so you really have to do it. But it really makes a difference. The other thing is a web-style navigation paradigm can work very well for all kinds of applications. Once you decouple this from latency and standard bodies mistakes and all kinds of issues, the basic idea of how you now have hypertext is not necessarily tied to a web browser. And having the domain-specific language, applying combinators in this domain of graphical user interface also seems to have worked very well. And Newspeak in general makes it really easy to embed these internal DSLs, which I'll be talking about later in the week. And there, 25 minutes. Well, we cheated. We started a minute early. And I'm done. Any questions?
I have a language question. Earlier you showed the syntax of Newspeak with open brace and then a keyword message inside of it.
Did I? Okay. Let's try and find that. Or was that in the demo? Probably in the demo. Hang on. We'll find that as we speak.
I was just going to ask what that represented. Where's the receiver? That's a good.
Okay. So yes. So in Smalltalk, you always have to write the receiver. Those of you who know Self know that you didn't have to write the receiver there. And you don't necessarily have to write a receiver in Newspeak either. If you don't write one, it's implicit, and what the precise meaning of that is a whole interesting discussion. But basically, it's the object in the surrounding lexical scope that supports that message. Yeah.
So it looks like you've got a lot of this dynamic code that's user-generated running in the IDE. That's where the power is coming from? Is that?
Well, part of it, the fact that is an example of the power, right? You can have users write code and modify the IDE if they want to. We don't actually usually do that because hopefully the IDE is functioning well. And the thing is, we can customize, we can experiment, we can do that. And if you have people who are unhappy with what you've done, then they can tweak it very easily.
It's less about. I guess what I was worried about with user-written code,
Can they screw themselves? Oh yes.
Yeah. And how often, how often you find as you're doing these kinds of things that you just bring the whole thing down and God knows what happens.
Not very often, but it certainly is possible to shoot yourself in the foot. And of course, there are ways around that. And where's Alan? Alan can tell you all about how to avoid that. But in general, it doesn't happen as often as you might think. It's actually quite rare. Occasionally, yes, you go change a method in object the wrong way, and the world has ended, right? But that doesn't happen. That happens very, very rarely.
I like to say Smalltalk is a lot of rope.
It is a lot of rope, but it doesn't. You don't hang yourself nearly as often as you'd think with all that rope, and so the trade-off is worthwhile to me, at least, to a lot of people. Dave.
You might want to mention images and audit trails that you get so that everything you're doing,
I might want to mention it if I bought that, but images are a double-edged sword. That's the truth, right? You can screw yourself with images, right? Because what happens in a typical image is you have integrated your program into the state of your process. And the state of your process can go bad in all kinds of ways, and the issue is always extricating your program when that happens And that isn't as easy as just, running the compiler again on those dead files lying on the disk. Now, this can be fixed, and it's been fixed before, and we're fixing it. Alan?
So I just wanted to comment that, these types of environments, small hawk environments, once upon a time were quite extensively marketed by IBM and a number of other companies, quite extensively to enterprise IDE organizations. And the sort of problem you're concerned about simply was not a common issue. That was my business. I did it. And that was not what we heard about as problems that were coming from the users.
Did anyone have questions about the presentation as opposed to small talk or in general? Yeah?
I see there's a fragment. I guess that's moving in the direction of your optional type declaration.
Yeah.
Those are words that are blue highlighted, but some of the other DSL declarations like column, length, row, and all that, can you right-click on those to go to the...
Not yet. Small matter of programming. Right now, you can't really. You'll have to paste them into the search thing and see what comes out. I guess. Let's see. Sad to say. Oh, I must have column. Oh, I didn't get the colon. And let's see what it comes up. So yeah, this is a list of stuff that has column in it. And we can find column, and it'll find things. So now we have in different places implementers and senders of column and stuff like that. So, but making them direct links, well, there are UI issues with that sometimes as to how ambiguous it is. But basically, because this is a portable framework, getting this to work getting the text to work the right way in different places, it just isn't implemented yet. Yeah.
Do you have any demos that don't look like web browsers that do kind of spinning windows that create like frogs and stuff?
Squeak does. We went to great lengths to lobotomize this stuff, actually. I'm not sure if it'll work. No, we took out the goddamn eToys. Oops, some of my friends might hear this. The thing is, I can show it to you if offline, but it's quite cool in its way. But we went to great lengths to stop this because it's from a computer science perspective, it's really cool that you can do this, and the GUI is, everything is a visual thing that can be manipulated any which way, and it's very compositional. As a user interface, it's really bad. Think of your mother using a computer, and literally the windows can fall apart in her hands, right? Because you can pick up the title bar and move it somewhere else. We actually, when at Cadence, when we were shipping stuff to early adopting customers, we actually had an incident when one of the engineers went to give a talk there. She did a rehearsal in front of us, and in the middle she got stuck because we thought we had closed all the options. It turned out that you press some control sequence in Squeak, and then you can edit the title bar. And so she had caps lock pressed or something, and suddenly she couldn't drag the window because it was expecting her to type and change the title bar, right? It is really a bad idea in terms of a general user interface. And so we have gone to, now this certainly isn't an issue here, right? Because this is a real window, right? You can't do that anymore. But if we go back to Morphic, in theory you can do this. We've gone to some lengths to shut that down.
So, but is the assertion that web browsers are enough and Hopscotch supports web browser style navigation and GUIs and that's the end of it and that's all you need?
So I didn't say web browsers enough. First of all, web browsers will be enough because they're evolving, and that's something people in this building are no doubt worried about. But they're not enough as they stand. But hypertext navigation very much is, right? This is not limited to what a web browser can do, right? So it does things like open things in place, and there are no security restrictions on it. So it can open a new window. It can do all the interesting stuff. But basically, the navigation paradigm. Maybe Photoshop, right? Sometimes you'll have to open a fragment that is actually some sort of graph, thing where you can turn something in 3D or whatever. But the coarse navigation and the kind of stuff you usually do in an IDE and so forth, I don't see that we on the contrary, we don't miss anything. We're actually doing a lot better than the conventional 20 panes and sort of Eclipse style. Phil.
So I quite like this idea that everything is a document and that you get this browser framework. can you say something about how widely applicable that is? I could imagine that there are things I would really like doing that way, and other things I wouldn't like doing that way. Maybe some places where I'd be surprised I get a lot of benefit from it. Can you say where it works well?
Well, you know, our vast, the hundreds of thousands of users that have been, well, sorry, I was just dreaming. So we found that it worked very well for what have we done with this? Essentially, there was an application at Cadence that was basically, again, a tool, a CAD tool of sorts, right? So in a way, in some ways, it might be reminiscent of an IDE as well, but for something very different. We generally found that this worked very well for all the things we did. Now, we haven't done lots and lots of things. I'd argue that, again, if you were doing Photoshop and needed to graphically, you know, at a fine grain, there's things you don't do this way. There's actually a diagramming package for this that let you actually draw diagrams, but it did it inside one of these guys, right? So sometimes you have to create a particular kind of fragment that where inside it behaves differently. But for generally organizing, you know, your life, which is what mainly an IDE is doing, and for lots of other applications like the file browser, I've found that I've missed this already when I'm using other applications on my Mac. Of course, I don't usually run this using Windows, but calendars, whatever. I find that I already missed the non-modality, for example, the fact that I can always go back and forth and things like that. That I always have a history, that I don't have to wait for the guy who wrote that particular application to figure out that it would be a useful thing. I already missed this in those kinds of client apps. I'm way over time, aren't I? But if nobody's going to stop me, sure.
The underlying platform
Yeah.
Newspeak implementation is Java.
The underlying implementation is Smalltalk. This is Squeak Smalltalk. The reason it is A, it is far easier to implement these semantics on a system like that than any of the mainstream platforms with or without their extensions to support dynamic stuff. It is still, they were not designed to do this. Those extensions aren't nearly the full, you know, extent of what you'd like. So it's easier. And it's open source, and it's a VM that you can change bytecodes like, you know, trivially. It's really a really easy framework to work with. And it had a liberal license. So there were a bunch of all kinds of pragmatic reasons for doing it. If John, is John here? I'm sure he's here somewhere. All right. Yeah, right. If John's work is going to get out there, as I believe it will eventually, and be a product, so something that we, you know, can rely on, then it might be interesting. And I still need to jump through an awful lot of hoops to make this work, even with those facilities that he's providing, and similarly for the DLR or even more. So there's a reason why it doesn't run on that stuff. It could be made to run with the dynamic language support that's starting to come online with a lot of effort. And it could be made to run on other things. V8 in particular is kind of an interesting case, because that means you really run in a browser, and it's probably fast enough that it might actually be usable. Right? Well, so we should talk about, you know, compiling Smalltalk and such to you know, there are issues. Any other questions? Thank you.